So we are live. Welcome to the synthesis of Forrest Landry's work. In this live stream, I'm going to be going into a broad overview of Forrest Landry's work as well as a deep dive. I will be recording a podcast with him later today. We'll go live in about a week or two, and um, yeah, this live stream is a way for me to synthesize as many aspects of his work that I have been studying for the last couple weeks and to really, yeah, bring forth a synthesis. So if I look over here, I'm looking at my notes. So Forrest Landry's work. So his seminal work was Immanent Metaphysics, a book called Metaphysics. He has two or three other books, but the magnum opus is Immanent Metaphysics. And within it, he lays forth the abstract foundations for his work on metaphysics, which I will be going into here. So, some of the key aspects of his work are there's a couple key aspects. One is the self does not own or have choice. Rather, self is an evolving context of many choices. Another aspect is that the nature of choice is more fundamental than the nature of self. Another one is that for choice to be choice, it must have consequences. Another one is that metaphysics needs clarity of essence, not simplicity of appearance. So this is one that I've been sitting with for a while. That clarity is more important than simplicity. Complexity mixed with clarity is better than simplicity alone, because a lot of times simplicity will reduce and take away the fundamental aspects of an idea. We see a push in our culture for like the Feynman technique and stuff to um, simplify everything and try to make every complex topic simple. But really, like, sometimes complexity isn't a bad thing as long as it has clarity. There's complexity without clarity, and it's just like a bunch of jumbled complexity that makes no sense. And there's complexity with a lot of clarity, where there's still a lot of moving parts, but each moving part is very specific and clear. And so he writes that metaphysics is a search for fundamental symmetries and continuities in the relation between self and reality. This is one of his core points in his book, is that the relationship between self and reality, that is what metaphysics explores, and that the relationship between self and reality is more fundamental than either the subjective or the objective, which is a very fascinating concept. And so, therefore, a description of being cannot be considered independently of the manner by which it is arrived at doing. And so he connects that epistemology and ontology are fundamentally related, because the ontology of a thing, the nature of it, the nature of its being, is intrinsically interwoven and interdependent with the epistemology of that thing, with the method by which you know it. And therefore, the method by which you know something requires that there is something to be known, and that which is known requires a method to know it. Another way of saying this is that the claim that X exists is a claim that, at a minimum, it is possible to interact with X. If it is impossible to interact with a thing, then it can't be claimed that the thing exists, which goes against a lot of, and so immanent metaphysics is an in-depth, complex, clear explanation of a metaphysical foundation to build other stuff off of, which is in many ways antithetical to the metaphysical implicit assumptions of Western civilization. So therefore, some of the ways that Landry's immanent metaphysics differs is that, and he actually points this out too. In Western culture, we have two assumptions in our metaphysics: that of dualism and monism. Dualism, that the mind is separate from the body, and monism, that that which is material is the thing, is the one thing that exists and that is real, that is objective. And in his metaphysics, he lays out that the relationship between self and reality is what is real, and the subjective and the objective are less real than the relationship between them. In this metaphysics, it's an in-depth exploration of the relationship between subject and object. And so there are many ways that he explores this, and he has this core concept of a what he calls foundational triplication, but it's this triple, three concepts that are non-interchangeable, distinguishable, and inseparable. And so some of these are choice, change, and causality, value, purpose, meaning, man, nature, machine, practice, principle, rule. And these are some of the triplications that he sets forth, and that we will be exploring in the podcast. And so I'm going to try to understand what choice, change, and causality, the triplication of that, is based on what he wrote in this book. I'm going to do that through explaining it here and through the act of explaining it in this video. I'm hoping it will bring forth insights. So he writes that the fabric of consciousness is made up of change, causality, and choice. The reality of selves, of existing as a self, is the composition only of change, causality, and choice. Causality here is defined that when a subjective context perceives consistency between two objective contents. Choice here is defined as the objective expression of a consistency between two subjective contexts, and change is defined as continuity of content and asymmetry of context of the interaction of the subjective and the objective. And so the idea of this triplication is that change, causality, and choice all mutually afford each other. And they do it in a very specific way. Choice affords change. Change affords causality, and causality affords choice, which affords change, which affords cause, which affords choice, and on and on and on. And it has to be in this way. And this is something that I'm very interested in exploring with Forrest, is that why is it choice, then change, then causality, then choice? Because when you make a choice, it creates changes in the world, which cause a different agent arena landscape from which to make choices in the future. That's how I'm currently perceiving it. And I'm not sure if that is the truth of Forrest Landry's experience in the way that and I'm not sure if that is the thinking that gave rise to this explanation of choice, change, and causality. So he writes that the more one goes into the world, objective, the more that being seems to be defined by causality, that the causality of the world affects us. Whereas the more one goes into the self, the more that being is defined by the experience of choice. On the boundary between self and world, one finds only change. So change here would be the relationship between self and world, where self is the basis of choice and world is the basis of causality. The relationship between self and world is that of change, which is really interesting because the choices we make affect the world, and that process of mutually affording and inter affecting each other is the nature of change as I understand it in Forrest Landry's perspective. And so there's a lot to explore here. So I will keep going. But what's fascinating is that of the well, there's two things I want to explore here. There's one is he sets forth three modalities through which the self can be in relationship to world: the immanent modality, the transcendent modality, and the omniscient modality. And so these are like the three meta classes from which we can understand how the self can be in relationship to reality. And in all of these triplications, each one of the classes takes one of these modalities: transcendence, omniscience, or immanence. And so, immanence, as he defined it, is being within, interacting in the world, being in relationship. It's a, as John Vervaeke would say, a sort of participatory form of knowing. That is how I understand how Landry lays out what immanence is. And so let me go here to, okay, yeah. The immanent is referring to that which is immediate and intrinsic in our own experience and in our own perception and expression. And so perception and expression seem like obvious words, but these are also very clearly defined in a very interesting way. He writes that perception, let me find it here. Perception right, so there's two types of interactions between subjective and objective. And so we can see that, let me find it again here. Perception is when the objective is directed towards the subjective. So when there's something in the objective, it's a receiving process. The arrow is going from to objective to subjective, whereas the nature of expression is that of subjective to objective, starting from subjective with the arrow pointing towards objective. And so what Forrest says is that the nature of the immanent modality is that which is immediate and intrinsic in one's own perception and expression. That which is immediate and intrinsic. The immediacy, the immediate experience, intrinsic to perception and expression, is the nature of the immanent modality. Another way of saying this is that the immanent is a reflection of a sense of being within a world as a participant and of experiencing this directly in first person terms. The immanent is like this first person. It's sense of being in a world, participating in a world as a first person subjective experience. The second modality is that of the omniscient modality. The omniscient is, as you might say, the omniscient is taking from the outside and looking in. That's how I understand it. Think of like how Christians see God. They see him as the creator of reality. that which is outside of reality looking in on reality. You could say that the Christians see God as having an omniscient modality relationship. The metaphysics of God is that of an omniscient modality. So, how Forrest Landry defines the semantics of the omniscient modality is that he sees it as all knowing because it's perceiving a domain from a frame of reference that is external to it. The central aspect that allows this type of knowing is the difference in frames of a reference. A point of view, a perspective which includes all of the domain viewed. So if this is the domain viewed, a point of view which is from the outside, which includes all of it, where that which is perceiving it is not a part of the frame. So if there's a frame, if there's some domain that is being perceived from the outside in which the perceiver is not a part of the frame, this is an omniscient modality relationship. It's an external looking in. So some activities that come from the omniscient modality are description, naming, explanation, description, naming, and explanation. So a couple of examples of the omniscient modality. The classical scientific perspective is a largely omniscient perspective. To say God has made and has total control over this world is to assert an omniscient God in relation to this world. Also, any concept of deity that created the world and departed, not including the idea that God is still here in this moment, creating in this moment, is an omniscient concept of theology. That is a direct quote from Immanent Metaphysics. So lastly, any statement that defines the relationship between two particular specific things which are not of the self / observer, or that applies in a well-defined context, is a statement of the omniscient mode. I'm going to say that again. A statement that defines the relationship between two things in a well-defined context is a statement of the omniscient mode. And that statement that defines those two things, the thing that's defining it can't be included in those two things. That which is perceiving the domain is describing the relationship between two things, and it is not in and of itself a part of those two things. Is a statement of the omniscient modality. And so the third modality, transcendent, is the one that is the most tricky for me, and I'm going to do my best to describe it here. The semantics of the transcendent modality. So whereas immanent is within and participating as a first person being a thing, omniscient is from the outside looking in and being able to define the relationship between two things from the outside. Transcendent is, I almost want to say both of those things, but let's explore this more here. Any relational mode where the context of the relation is completely outside of the frame of reference that defines the domain. Situations where a relation has no time or space components at all, but is based upon other measures of similarity and difference altogether. A transcendent relationship is one that has no position or no specific point of reference or context. And so therefore, it is something which is immanent, but which has no time or space or no reference or no location, and is like this shared context which can't be pinned down. And another one of the concepts that Landry lays out is that of the difference between possibility and actuality. So there's this difference between possibility and actuality. There's possibility It's like this creative space. It's that of creation. Another one of his triplications: creation, um, and choice, and something else. So a transcendent relationship has only possibility. It has only potentiality and not actuality. So whereas the imminence, as I currently understand it, has a lot of actuality. It is maybe it's even pure actuality because it is in the world. The transcendent relationship is purely potentiality. It has a lot of possibilities, but none of those possibilities have been actualized because it has no space, location, time. It does not mean moving into some other dimension, but rather getting outside of a given frame of reference altogether. So, whereas the omniscient and the immanent are both relating to some frame of reference, either from the inside or the outside, the transcendent is getting outside of the frame of reference altogether. He gives a couple of metaphors here, which I will relay for the purpose of getting at and understanding the nature of the transcendent modality. So there's this computer science metaphor. The relationship between the software and the hardware. So he says, from the perspective of the software of a computer, the hardware has no position in space or time. When someone is programming and writing computer code, they do not work with physical transistors, and the data with physical transistors when they're creating computer logic, writing code, where the hardware is invisible to the program. You're not working with the hardware when you're coding a computer program. Yet at the same time, it supports at all points the relation to the program, to the hardware. The relationship of the program to the hardware is effectively transcendent as viewed from the perspective of the program code. So it's that which supports, it's this invisible context which supports the entirety of the thing, but which is not found in the thing. A computer software, hardware, from the perspective of computer code, the hardware is supporting every single aspect of the program, but is invisible and can't be found within the computer program itself. So that was one metaphor. The fact of having no common relative position. It's not to say, however, that the software and the hardware of the computer are completely independent of each other. The program code affects and determines the connectivity and state of the hardware, and the hardware implements the software. All right, let's go to a different metaphor, that of a photo. Nah, let's go to the last metaphor. Dreams. There's three perspectives to experiencing a dream state. If you're dreaming, the imminent modal relationship between when you're dreaming, when you're in the dream, you're experiencing the dream as an imminent modality within the dream. There's this imminent modal relationship between the dreamer and the dream. And so, if you're in the dream, experiencing the dream, that is an imminent modal context. Whereas the dreamer, the physical being that you are that created the dream, I almost don't want to even use the word physical. You're standing outside of the dream because you are the creator of it. There's in a sense that you're standing outside of it. This is omniscient modal relationship with the dream because you are the one that is actually the that which is creating the dream in the first place. So you are outside of it, being able to see the entire frame slash domain of the dream. And therefore, you have an omniscient modal relationship to the dream. Whereas the awake self, being in a waking state rather than a dreaming state, and remembering the dream the next morning. So not only are you standing apart from the dr- the experience of being in the dream and the creator of the dream. All right, so when you're sleeping, sometimes you can become conscious of the fact that you're creating the dream. So that would be the dreamer versus the dreamed. So the transcendent modal relationship is being awake and remembering the relationship, or both the dream, being in the dream and creating the dream. See, it's the transcendent is the hardest one to get. The part of the self that is within the daydream is a character or participant. In full dreaming, one experiences that reality is the immanent fraction of the self. Part of the self is creating the daydream, controls all that goes on within. This overseer is the omniscient fraction of the self. The part of the self that may remember other daydreams and see the connection. Oh, okay. The part of the self that may remember other dreams and see the connection between these other dreams, that has an experience of both the waking world and the dreaming world, is the transcendent fraction of self. All three fractions together compose the complete self, which straddles all three of these characteristics slash modalities. All right. Now let's explore some of Forrest Landry's other works. Um, so there's a couple. Forrest Landry had a interview with John Vervaeke, and within it, some very interesting things emerged. That's what I will now be exploring. So, in this conversation from Voicecraft, um, very cool project that I fully support, they go into a lot of different things, and I'm going to try to get the essence of it here. So, I've only watched an hour and a half of it, so I got 30 minutes to go. So don't quote me on the last part, but Vicky says that the meaning crisis comes out of an agent and the nature of their behavior to their environment. With the emergence of agency comes the emergence of problem solving and the ability to modify one's behavior to improve the conditions for some system. Some autopoietic entity. The system, I think, is what Vervaeke is referring to. And so, Forrest Landry talks about how do we think about the relationship between values, knowledge, and action. Another one of his triplications. And this is all right. So this is something that's been popping up within Forrest Landry's talks, as well as that with Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hull. They talk about how optimizing, you can never fully solve problems by optimizing for something. When you optimize for something, there are always externalities that you don't think about. And therefore, a slightly more complex approach that is, I almost want to say, more in line with Landry's ethics of what good choice making is. A better choice in a situation is to focus on the relationship between things. To focus on the relationship between things. This relationship is more fundamental. And so in this in this podcast, he says, how do we think about the relationship between values, knowledge, and action? Values, knowledge, and action. How do we think about the relationship between these? Which it kind of ended on that, and I'm not fully sure what the reference is to all of those three things and the relationship between them. And all right, so another triple that they explore that I am interested in touching on here is meaning, purpose, and value. This is something that's come up multiple interviews with Forrest Landry. The basis of it that he talks about is that our culture has made purpose so paramount that it has displaced value and meaning. That you can't have meaning without a relationship of both purpose and value. Purpose here I would define as um, like a goal, value as like a principle, and meaning as like a larger um, the feeling of meaningfulness. I'm not sure if that's what it exactly is. And so something that I will explore more here is there's three triples that Forrest Landry relates to each other in a symmetry slash continuity way. I'm still not sure exactly how to use symmetry, the word symmetry and continuity in the context and the definitions that Forrest has laid forth in immanent metaphysics. But there's these three triads. So one is vision. All right, all right, let me just set forth the three different triads. So one is vision, culture, and strategy. Another is value, meaning, and purpose. And another is man, nature, machine. So he says that the vision, actually, no, let me start with purpose. The purpose, he's saying that purpose has become so paramount in our culture that it has displaced meaning and value. And that purpose is synonymous or can be aligned with other triples of strategy or machine. So this system, this strategy, just like executing on a strategy for some purpose slash goal is a very machine like thing to do. And the essence of this is that our culture has put this as such a foundation that human flourishing, human well-being has been subjected to or co-opted by this machine-like system of strategy and purpose, in that all of the startups and businesses in the ecosystem of Western civilization starts with strategy and purpose, machine, and co-ops value and meaning in man, in nature, in culture, and vision. And so he says even vision. So he says we don't even want to start with vision. A lot of times we start with I think how he said it is that in Western culture, companies start with vision. They start with this a founder that has a vision, then he has a strategy for how to accomplish it, and then the culture is last. The culture being synonymous with meaning and like nature and that which affords life. And so the workers of this company get subjective and co-opted by the strategy of this company, and it sucks all of the life force out of these people. And on a civilization level scale, he's saying this is what is happening, that all that is good in human beings is being extracted, manipulated, and co-opted by this machine that we've created, which is the system with its fundamental basis as strategy, purpose, goals, and machine. You can think of this as bottom line. So he's proposing that we start with culture. What is it like? What does human flourishing look like on a collective level? We must start with that and then have the strategy be in service of that rather than culture being in service of the organization. And in his conversation with John Vervaeke ties in that this dynamic of having human life force be in service of a vision of a CEO and of a company has this pseudo slash para religious undertone, which is saying that we almost get our religious meaning in the world these days in modern culture. The substitute, the false substitute at that, has been organizations. That the vision and mission of an organization has taken the role of a larger meaning and purpose that previously was found in a religious context. And so fascinating to me, something that I'm still exploring here. And so I'll read a couple notes here to elucidate this point with a bit more clarity. And so what they were saying is that the meaning crisis is a result of strategy being cynically used when strat. All right, no. When strategy cynically uses vision in order to manipulate culture. Like in Silicon Valley, there's a tremendous bias to have a founder slash CEO that has a strategy and uses the vision of changing the world to collect a community of believers. This is where the para-religious undertone comes in. Then acts as a way of coordinating and manipulating what the employees do and manipulating what the customers do. So in essence, the vision and the mission statement are a cohering force for the staff in a para-religious way. The meaning crisis is essentially when one aspect of these triples, the vision, culture, strategy triple, the value, meaning, purpose triple, or the man, nature, machine triple. It's when one aspect of these triples overtakes the other two and they become out of balance. And when one of them acts as if they were fundamental to the other two and displaces the other two, when the life, like this precious life aspect in all of us, is being dominated by the system. And this is the foundational aspect of what Daniel Schmachtenberger talked about in his podcast with Liv Bory, that that we're so scared of AGI, but that our civilization right now is essentially an AGI already, in the way that the game theoretic relationship between the different aspects and parties in our culture, how they're in relationship to one another, is one that is very similar to that of AGI, in that, and this is exactly what Forrest Landry is saying here as well, that that our that our life force, that which is worth loving, this essence of life, this the beauty of existence, is currently being co-opted for strategy, purpose, or machine. That our entire civilization is a machine that is co-opting the life force of everyone within it. And because there's this like Moloch dynamic of everyone's in win-lose games and trying to outcompete one another, that if one person stops, someone else will take their place. It's really difficult because it requires that a lot of parties stop at the same time. And yeah, it's basically in civilization as discussed, is basically an automated general intelligence that is co-opting human life force. So, all right, I'm going to keep going. I'm kind of talking in circles. The alternative is that the culture slash collective comes up with a vision of what it needs for conscious, sustainable evolution. And the strategy comes out of that rather than the other way around. So let me reiterate that. The collective comes up with a vision of what it looks like for conscious, sustainable evolution. And the strategy comes out of that vision, out of that culture, rather than culture coming out of that strategy. So there's a deep cynicism in how companies are founded because they start with strategy and then co-opt the life force of everyone involved. As Vervaeke said, it's co-opted because these organizations are pseudo-religious because you're not just getting people together to work. You're co-opting their sociability, identities, and their roles. Their way of participating in the world, their participatory knowing, is being co-opted for these organizations. And it masks the hunger for the legitimate culture and religious types of behavior that people undergo when they transform their sociability, identity, and moving towards the bigger picture. It's anti-life at every level. Assuming that this centralized initiation place is going to result in a new market with extractionary dynamics, there's a huge incentive to take advantage of ambient forces to create parasitic process that will result in huge gains for the shareholders and investors. It takes these impulses towards life and co-ops them. It takes natural processes and co-ops them towards an artificial one. So the machine is basically an artificial process Furthermore, that learned helplessness becomes part of the strategy of these organizations to maintain the operation of the whole system. Forrest Landry's fundamental tenet is that technology at its root is toxic. That human values have been displaced by financial values. So there's this triple of simplicity, complexity, and clarity. All right, so the last part that I'm going to be diving into is that of the it's called The Transition, a talk between Forrest Landry, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and Jordan Hull. And so there are a couple things I will be exploring here. Try to find my notes on the topic. Well, all right, so the essence of Forrest Landry's work is he talks about an ethics, new ethics of choice, an ethics of how do we make good choices. There's this is-ought problem that comes up a lot, that science can tell us what is, but it can't tell us what should be. The ethics of a good choice is telling us what should be. It's the basis by which we figure out what our values are and how to enact those in the world. Existential risks are the results of causation as a tool for changing our environment. The relationship between technology and life, such as on the issue of artificial intelligence. Technology can't be considered the solution to all our problems because technology, like science, can tell us what we can do, but not what we should do. Therefore, what's most important is how do we know what the right thing to do is? How do we know what a good choice is? And that no amount of causation will ever get us even the tiniest understanding of choice. That choice is transcendent beyond causation, the same way causation is transcendent beyond change. He defines the woke movement, which I feel particularly um, well in touch with, being out here in Boulder, um, as addressing inequality and consent. There's this critique of causal processes and everything that goes with it, that we need to be more aware of how to make choices. We need to design systems like governance and community and distinguish between them. We become so enamored with causation that we replace community processes with institutional processes. There's this assumption that we made that the only way that we can make collective choices is through institutions. We need to get rid of this assumption and realize that there's multiple ways we can have community processes, that we are wise enough to make the choices, that we're focused on long-term sustainable evolution. Ethics is the principle of effective choice. Good choices are effective to the degree that they enhance life, create community, and develop nurturing relationships that build a better future. What we can ask ourselves are, what are the choices we make individually and collectively that provide for our future and for our next generation? If we want a world where we have freedom of choice and the capacity to make good choices, we're going to need to reconcile these dynamics. All right, so that was actually not the transition. Now I'm going to go into the transition. So I was thinking some of what was brought up in the transition with Forrest Landry is that asking questions and thinking is so important. And some of the question that we can ask is, when we're talking to someone, we're in dialogue. The dialogue is really important because it gives us access to someone's worldview in a way that broadcast media or any form of broadcast information does not. Which is funny to me because I'm learning all this stuff about Forrest Landry from broadcast media. But that aside, something that I found really interesting is that he says we can ask these questions like, what is truly important? What does this actually mean? Like what they're saying, what does this actually mean? Like what is underneath what they're saying? What is important in what they're saying? And what are the implications of what they're saying? So these three questions I asked in relationship to Forrest Landry's work, and some of the things that I came up with are this. Some of the implications of his work are that scientific materialism and the core assumptions of our culture are wrong, that there's another way to think about them, and that he has developed those things. Another implication is that understanding the nature of choice can change our agency and our relationship to life. We can make better choices, that increasing the quality of our choices is an inherently meaningful process. And all right, so on the nature of choice, what does this actually mean when he's talking about choice? He's saying that choices are essentially irreversible. That if you can reverse a choice, it's not a real choice. There is risk in choices because they are irreversible. Get this, a choice is inherently risky because it is irreversible, and therefore learning how to make good choices is an inherently meaningful process. All right, so what does this actually mean? Another aspect of his work, he's another thing that he's getting at is that mystery and awe are fundamental and help us grok the unknowable. That awe is important and worth cultivating. All right, so there's another concept that I find interesting here, which is that which is that when you're talking to someone, you never know what they're going to say. You can never predict what someone is going to say with certainty. He calls this concept the concept of irreducible uncertainty, that when we're talking to someone, their choice to us is received as pure randomness because we have no clue what they will say. And that if we relate to communication in this way, it can honor the other person because love is that which enables choice. Love is that which enables choice. The implications of love is that which enables choice are that when you're with another person, don't assume where they're at or what they're going to say and relate to them in a way. A good choice is one that enables others. Love is that which enables choice, that enables the choice in others to the greatest degree, as well as not compromising your own choice making capacities. All right, so I'm going to go into this talk now. There's this essence that dialogue is really important. With dialogue, we can get really curious about what someone is thinking, slash saying, and how they perceive the world. A lot of conversations are based on the belief. Good conversations are based on a foundation that what someone else is saying is meaningful, that there is signal there. So we must engage in dialogue so that we can have a more accurate understanding of what reality actually is, because every single person in the world has partial truth. The only way that we're going to get a more accurate understanding of reality is to have and engage in meaningful dialogue with these other people. Through doing this, we can, but also through our own processes, there's a goal of becoming aware of our own biases and working with our blind spots, because on a societal, so our civilizational level, a lot of what is going on, a lot of the problems, are a result of sociological blind spots. And the way that we overcome these blind spots is by, according to Forrest, or how I understand what he was saying, by engaging in deeper and more meaningful dialogue with a better listening skills that helps us more deeply and adequately understand people as they actually are and what they're actually saying. And so, in order to do this, we must slow down, sink into the truth, into the signals of our nervous system, what they're actually telling us, to communicate those effectively. Then there's a bit of talk about system design. How you really deeply need to know what the problems are that the previous system solves in order to change the system, because if you don't, you're going to end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater inevitably. In order to design a new system, you need to have an adequate understanding of the previous system, the ways in which it worked, so that you know what works and what didn't work, and how to change the things that didn't work, but not the things that did work. Again, a common theme of Forrest's work is simplicity, clarity, and complexity, how they all co-arise with each other. this podcast with Forrest, I'm going to set forth a bottom up way of going about the conversation rather than a top down. This is what we're going to talk about. Bottom up. These are the ideas that I find most interesting in his work. Do with them, run with them in the direction that feels most relevant. So, how do we make good choices? So, all right, so there's a couple things here I'm going to write down. There are, at the core of his work is ethics / choice making. Making is triples and is what else have we explored? Yeah, triples, especially the modalities. All right. And then another aspect of his work, well, he talks a lot about clarity and complexity, and simplicity. All right. Talks a lot about civilization and existential risk. Civilization as AGI, which is freaking fascinating. And yeah. So now I'm going to find this thing on AGI that he wrote. All right. How do we know the truth? AGI, tech usage inherently cannot eventually result in total extinction of all planetary life. AGI, total human extinction. Some aspects of how technology can be used is a very serious problem. Known X risk factor of the very highest category will end all known life if we do not change course. So then, overviews of the argument, AGI, non-safety, scope of work, narrative sequence, comic overview, argument, organization, introduction, theoretical limits. So he starts out with his book in the theoretical limits to controlling any AGI using any method of causation. And then in part 2, he goes into the economic decoupling of value exchanges between the organic ecosystem and the artificial ecosystem. So I think this is what he was talking about in thing that being in service to AGI. No people as pets, a dialogue on the complete failure of exogenous AGI alignments. A very basic presentation of a clear argument as to why any form of external AGI superintelligence alignment and or thus of any form of planetary safety in the long term eventually is strictly and absolutely impossible in direct proportion to its degree of inherent artificiality. That any attempt to implement or use AGI will eventually result in total termination of all carbon-based life on this planet. Some aspects of the question problem: can anyone / humanity attain AGI alignment? So to address that, we can begin by asking, what is AGI alignment? The notion of AGI alignment is usually taken to mean some notion of or suggesting that some learning machines or artificial general intelligence and or advanced planning strategy system, particularly as inclusive of any sort of notion of any sort of being or agent, regardless of if it is itself a robot or in a robot body or not, has direct or indirect engagement with the world, however it was constructed, intended to be used. So I think what he's trying to get at is, can we use AGI without killing ourselves? we must decouple value exchanges between the organic ecosystem and the artificial ecosystem. Yeah. So decoupling organic and artificial ecosystem value exchanges. Thank you for listening to the live stream. Have to go. If you like this, please let me know. Send me an email at ethanwnel@gmail.com. I would love to hear if these are something that you find value in, that you would like to hear more of. If you're interested in participating in one, if you're interested in the work of Vervaeke, Forrest Landry, etc., let me know. We can get both of us on a live. You can participate in a live stream. These are pretty new to me, something I'm still trying out. And yeah, it's a cool medium through which to explore the thinking process and to connect ideas. So thank you for listening.